Rain fell upon London with the sudden authority of a judgment long delayed, striking the cobblestones outside Almack's assembly rooms until the street shimmered like a tarnished mirror. Carriages crowded the curb in obedient rows, their lacquered sides gleaming beneath wavering lantern light, while footmen shouted warnings and lifted hems from mud that showed no mercy to silk. Within those walls, the night still pulsed with violins and polite laughter, but outside, dignity was far more fragile. It was here, amid the confusion of umbrellas colliding and doors flung open in haste, that Miss Eliza Harcourt's fortune faltered, not through design, but through a single, fateful misstep. She had waited longer than propriety advised, hoping the rain would soften, unwilling to burden her aunt with haste or complaint. When at last the sky broke entirely, Eliza gathered her cloak and descended the steps with quiet resolve, her slippers already ruined, her thoughts fixed only on escape from the spectacle. A carriage door stood open before her, its interior dim yet inviting, and without lifting her eyes she entered, murmuring an apology meant for no one in particular. Only when the door closed and the world went abruptly still did she sense the error, a change in air, a faint scent of polished wood and something sharper, more refined. Her glance rose at once, and with it came the understanding that would later be called carelessness, ambition, or worse by those who had not been there. The carriage bore the crest of a duke. Eliza felt the blood leave her face, yet she did not cry out, nor did she scramble back into the rain. Instead, she inclined her head and spoke, her voice steady though her heart protested the calm. "I beg your pardon, sir. I have entered the wrong conveyance." There was no duke within, only empty cushions and the echo of her own restraint. She reached for the door, but it opened from without, revealing not the anonymity she prayed for, but witnesses. Several figures stood near enough to observe her exit, their expressions sharpening with interest as recognition dawned. In that instant, Eliza understood how swiftly London could invent a story. She stepped down, her shoes sinking into wet stone, and met their glances without defiance or apology beyond what was owed. She neither fled nor lingered. She simply departed, her back straight, her hands folded, carrying the weight of unspoken judgment with a composure learned through years of modest expectation. Behind her, whispers stirred, already forming shapes she could not control. Among those who observed was Lady Margaret Ashcombe, sister to the Duke of Ashcombe, a woman whose presence in any room carried the quiet authority of long practice. She had come late to the assembly, untroubled by rain, her attention drawn not to the music within but to the scene unfolding without. She watched the young woman's entrance, her realization, her exit, and most importantly, her restraint. Lady Margaret had seen panic before, and calculation, and the graceless eagerness of those who sought advancement at any cost. What she saw now was different. The girl's mistake had been genuine, her recovery deliberate, her dignity intact despite the danger of misinterpretation. Lady Margaret knew well the laws that governed her brother's life, the entailments and expectations that bound him to a marriage of consequence. She also knew the cruelty of a society that claimed virtue as its highest currency while delighting in the spectacle of a woman's fall. As the carriage door closed once more and the rain resumed its command, Lady Margaret made no comment, yet a decision had begun to take shape. She would learn who the girl was, not out of charity, but out of discernment. Such composure was rare, and rarity was not easily dismissed. Eliza did not hear the whispers that followed her all the way home, yet she felt them as surely as the damp that clung to her hem. Her aunt received her with mild reproach and concern, unaware of the small catastrophe that had already escaped into conversation. Eliza retired early, removing her gloves with hands that trembled only once the door was shut. She replayed the moment again and again, not with regret for the mistake itself, but for the attention it would invite. In a city governed by appearances, to be seen was to be judged, and she had been seen too clearly. The following morning brought no immediate reckoning, only the uneasy calm that precedes consequence. Eliza attended to her correspondence, her posture unaltered, her manners unruffled, yet beneath the surface lay a careful vigilance. She resolved to accept whatever came with the same restraint she had shown the night before, for she possessed neither fortune nor influence with which to contest rumor. All she owned was her conduct, and she guarded it fiercely. Elsewhere, Lady Margaret set her inquiries in motion with the discretion of long habit. Names were requested, connections traced, reputations weighed not by gossip but by consistency. She learned of Eliza Harcourt's upbringing, her education, her mother's quiet intelligence, her father's unremarkable honesty. There were no scandals to uncover, no debts concealed, no ambitions overstated. It was an ordinariness that impressed Lady Margaret most, for it suggested a character formed without artifice. By afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the city washed and restless. Carriages resumed their circuits, conversations resumed their patterns, and Almack's resumed its authority over the season. Eliza prepared herself to step once more into that world, unaware that her mistake had not condemned her, but instead marked her. She believed herself diminished, while elsewhere she was being measured. Thus the night's humiliation settled into something quieter and far more dangerous, the attention of those who could alter her fate, and the promise that a single moment, once witnessed, could never be entirely undone. London, indifferent and observant, held its breath, for the season had begun to rearrange lives, and one quiet woman now stood at its center. The London season advanced with its peculiar mixture of elegance and threat, and Eliza Harcourt felt its gaze sharpen upon her, though no one spoke to her directly of the carriage incident. Invitations did not cease, nor did they increase. Instead, conversations grew more deliberate, glances more assessing. She moved through drawing rooms with the same measured grace she had always possessed, yet now every courtesy felt weighted, as though her conduct were being silently recorded. Eliza understood that survival in such moments depended not upon explanation but upon consistency, for explanation invited suspicion, while constancy, maintained long enough, could exhaust curiosity. Lady Margaret Ashcombe observed these developments from a distance carefully chosen. She did not summon Eliza, nor did she publicly defend her. Instead, she arranged circumstances. A morning musicale at a mutual acquaintance's home placed them within the same room, separated by nothing more than polite introductions and shared attention to a pianist whose skill failed to justify the audience assembled. Lady Margaret noted how Eliza listened rather than performed interest, how she addressed each person with equal courtesy regardless of rank. Such behavior was unremarkable only to those who did not understand how rare it had become. It was at this gathering that the Duke of Ashcombe first properly saw Eliza Harcourt. He had heard her name, of course, spoken with a faint ambiguity reserved for women whose reputations hovered between notice and dismissal. He expected either a calculating beauty or a nervous creature undone by attention. Instead, he saw a woman of calm countenance and thoughtful reserve, her expression attentive without eagerness, her posture betraying neither ambition nor fear. The Duke, accustomed to performances, found himself unsettled by the absence of one. Their introduction was brief, conducted under Lady Margaret's watchful eye. The Duke inclined his head, his manner precise, and Eliza returned the courtesy with a composure that neither challenged nor diminished him. Their exchange concerned nothing of consequence, yet both were aware of the restraint required, of the danger inherent in appearing too interested. When they parted, it was with a polite certainty that their acquaintance had begun and must now be governed by forces beyond inclination alone. Society, however, is seldom content with such restraint. Whispers began to assemble around their names, encouraged not by evidence but by proximity. Eliza noticed how certain matrons observed her more closely, how questions about her plans were framed with greater interest. She responded as she always had, honestly but without invitation, aware that excessive defense could be mistaken for guilt. Her aunt, sensing the shift, advised caution, though she herself did not fully understand the source of the renewed attention. Lady Margaret, meanwhile, allowed a single token to pass between the two young people, small enough to escape immediate notice yet sufficient to bind memory. At a later gathering, when Eliza rose to depart, she discovered her gloves missing. They were returned to her before she reached the door, delivered by the Duke with an apology that carried no implication beyond courtesy. Yet the moment lingered, observed by more eyes than either could ignore. The exchange was innocent, but innocence, once witnessed, could be recast as intention. The Duke felt the scrutiny keenly. He had been raised to understand that his life belonged as much to his title as to himself, that marriage was not merely personal but strategic. His sister had spared him no lecture, yet her silence now was more persuasive than argument. He began to consider Eliza not as a possibility but as a question, one that challenged assumptions he had never been encouraged to examine. Her modest fortune, her lack of powerful connections, would once have dismissed her entirely. Now, they troubled him less than the absence of artifice in her presence. Eliza sensed the change as well, though she resisted naming it. She found herself measuring her words more carefully when he was near, not from calculation but from an instinctive desire to preserve what little dignity she possessed. She did not imagine herself a contender for his regard. Rather, she feared becoming a curiosity, elevated briefly before being set aside. Such elevation could be more dangerous than neglect, for it sharpened the fall. The season reached one of its crowded peaks with a formal assembly where alliances were expected to declare themselves. Eliza attended out of obligation, her gown chosen for simplicity rather than distinction. The Duke was present, his attention divided between duty and observation. When he requested her hand for a dance, the room seemed to still, not from surprise but from recognition that something unspoken had crossed into visibility. Eliza accepted, her expression unchanged, though her pulse betrayed her composure. The dance itself was unremarkable in form, yet every movement felt deliberate, constrained by the knowledge of eyes upon them. They spoke little, yet what was said mattered, for it revealed respect rather than possession, curiosity rather than claim. When the music ended, they separated with the same restraint that had governed their meeting, but restraint, once tested, is rarely forgotten. As the evening concluded, Eliza overheard a fragment of conversation not meant for her, a speculation spoken too freely. It was enough to remind her how precarious her position had become. She returned home with a sense of foreboding tempered by resolve, aware that she now stood at the edge of something she had not sought but could not entirely escape. Elsewhere, Lady Margaret watched the night conclude with quiet satisfaction, knowing that society had noticed what it could not yet define. The tokens had been exchanged, the whispers awakened, and the path forward narrowed, inviting either retreat or courage, neither of which could be chosen lightly. The interval between public regard and private truth narrowed one afternoon when Eliza was invited to Ashcombe House under the unremarkable pretext of viewing a small collection of botanical drawings. The invitation bore Lady Margaret's hand, precise and courteous, offering no hint of its deeper intention. Eliza accepted because refusal would have suggested fear, and fear would have confirmed the very suspicions she labored to quiet. She arrived with composed gratitude, aware that she crossed from observation into examination. Ashcombe House stood apart from the noise of the city, its rooms arranged not for display but for endurance, a reflection of the family that inhabited it. Eliza noted the absence of excessive ornament, the preference for order over opulence, and felt a curious easing of her guardedness. Lady Margaret received her warmly, yet with a measured affection of one accustomed to weighing consequence. They spoke first of harmless matters, of art and the changing light, allowing the space to settle around them before anything more dangerous emerged. The Duke joined them later, his entrance unannounced yet deliberate. Eliza rose, and he inclined his head, the exchange familiar now, yet altered by circumstance. Lady Margaret soon excused herself, leaving them together beneath the pretense of retrieving a portfolio. Silence followed, not awkward but expectant, as though both recognized the significance of being unobserved. The Duke gestured for Eliza to sit, and she did so, her hands folded with habitual care. He spoke first, his voice low and deliberate, acknowledging the attention that had gathered around them without naming it directly. He expressed regret for any discomfort she might have endured, careful not to assume fault nor claim protection. Eliza listened, her expression attentive, and replied with equal restraint, assuring him that she neither blamed him nor expected intervention. Her dignity lay not in denial, but in clarity, and it was this clarity that unsettled him most. They spoke then of reputation, not as rumor but as currency, and of how little control one truly possessed once it began to circulate. The Duke admitted, without self-pity, the weight of expectation that governed his choices, and Eliza confessed, without appeal, her fear of becoming a footnote in someone else's ambition. Neither sought sympathy. Instead, they exchanged understanding, careful and exacting, each phrase weighed for its implication. As the conversation deepened, restraint thinned. The Duke acknowledged his admiration, phrased not as desire but as respect, and in doing so crossed a boundary neither could ignore. Eliza felt the moment press upon her, the knowledge that she could not accept such regard lightly, nor dismiss it without cost. She answered with honesty that bordered on peril, admitting her regard for him while refusing to presume its future. Her voice did not waver, though her heart urged caution. Lady Margaret returned before the conversation could venture further, her presence restoring the balance between them. She observed the change with practiced eye, noting the subtle shift in posture, the gravity that had replaced formality. She did not question them, nor did she offer guidance. Instead, she concluded the visit with civility, allowing Eliza to depart without burdening her with expectation. Yet as the carriage drew away, Lady Margaret understood that a line had been crossed, one that could not be retraced. The days that followed carried a new tension. Eliza moved through society with heightened awareness, her composure intact but tested. She sensed the Duke's attention even when he did not approach her, and she felt the weight of Lady Margaret's silence, which now seemed charged with intent. She was neither claimed nor dismissed, existing instead in a precarious interval that demanded endurance. Rumor soon supplied what silence withheld. Eliza learned, through carefully phrased concern, that a match of considerable advantage was being discussed for the Duke, one that promised security and approval. The knowledge struck not as betrayal but as inevitability, yet it sharpened her resolve. She would not plead, nor would she retreat in disgrace. If regard existed, it must withstand choice. The Duke, for his part, felt the pressure close around him. Family allies spoke of duty with renewed urgency, presenting obligation as virtue. He listened, as he had been trained to do, yet found himself increasingly unwilling to surrender the clarity he had glimpsed. The memory of Eliza's measured honesty troubled him, for it revealed the cost of decisions made without conviction. When they next met, it was in passing, under the eyes of many. Their exchange was brief, but charged with what remained unsaid. Eliza inclined her head with unaltered courtesy, yet her gaze held steady, neither pleading nor withdrawn. The Duke returned the look, understanding that whatever came next would demand courage not from impulse, but from principle. As they parted, each carried the weight of that understanding alone. The season continued its relentless advance, indifferent to private reckoning, yet beneath its glitter, a decision gathered force. What had begun as scrutiny had become consequence, and though neither yet spoke of love, both recognized that the future would now be shaped not by avoidance, but by choice, and that choice, once made, would alter more than reputation. The season reached its inevitable reckoning on a night arranged for resolution rather than display, when society gathered not merely to observe but to conclude. Eliza entered the assembly with measured calm, her gown modest yet faultless, her expression composed by deliberate will rather than ease, knowing that by dawn her standing would be forever altered. The rumors that had trailed her now hovered openly, no longer whispered but weighed, and she felt neither fear nor triumph, only readiness to meet whatever judgment awaited her. The Duke arrived later, his presence commanding attention without courting it, his manner composed yet resolute, as though he had already crossed an internal threshold from which retreat was no longer possible. Lady Margaret observed them both, positioned between expectation and consequence, aware that the careful balance she had maintained now demanded conclusion rather than patience. When the moment arrived, it came without spectacle, announced only by the Duke's quiet request for Eliza's company, offered with formality yet unmistakable intent. They withdrew to a quieter corner, still visible yet no longer surrounded, where conversation could not be overheard but its significance could be read plainly enough. The Duke spoke first, his voice steady and unembellished, declaring that he would not allow speculation to govern what honor required him to say. He acknowledged the advantage of other matches, the comfort of compliance, and the esteem such obedience would earn, before stating, with careful emphasis, that none could compensate for the absence of respect freely given. Eliza listened, her breath measured, her hand still, aware that every word spoken now would shape not only her future, but the manner in which she must inhabit it. When she replied, her voice held no tremor, though emotion lay beneath its restraint, and she thanked him for his candor without presuming it carried promise beyond its present truth. She spoke of dignity as something preserved by choice, not bestowed by rank, and affirmed that she would accept neither favor born of pity nor protection that demanded her silence. The Duke answered her without haste, declaring that he sought no obedience purchased at such a cost, and that if he were to claim her regard, it would be openly, and at equal risk to himself. The words settled between them with the weight of irrevocable intent, transforming curiosity into resolve, and Eliza understood that retreat was no longer possible without surrendering the self she had guarded so carefully. Lady Margaret approached then, her expression unreadable, though her gaze held approval tempered by concern, aware that what unfolded would invite resistance from quarters less forgiving than herself. The Duke turned to his sister, acknowledging the expectations she had long borne, and stated, with respectful firmness, that he would answer for his choice without transferring its cost to another. Silence followed, not from shock but from recognition, as those nearest sensed that an outcome had been decided beyond persuasion, and that further argument would only diminish its dignity. By the time the assembly drew to its close, word had spread with remarkable clarity, not exaggerated but exact, that the Duke of Ashcombe had declared himself without apology or retreat. Eliza departed beneath watchful eyes, her posture unchanged, though relief and apprehension moved together within her, for she knew that acceptance would not silence all doubt, nor would it shield her from scrutiny. Yet as her carriage carried her away, she reflected that dignity chosen was stronger than dignity granted, and that whatever resistance awaited, she would meet it standing, not concealed. The days that followed confirmed both hope and hazard, as congratulations mingled with caution, and certain doors closed as others opened with reluctant respect. Lady Margaret endured the murmurs with practiced composure, defending no one directly, yet permitting no insult to pass unanswered. Her loyalty now claimed openly rather than by implication. The Duke addressed his obligations with renewed seriousness, negotiating terms that preserved estate and honor, while refusing any arrangement that questioned the legitimacy of his choice. Eliza remained steadfast, offering no display of triumph, understanding that grace in victory was as necessary as restraint in uncertainty, and that her conduct would shape judgment more enduringly than declaration. Gradually, resistance softened into acceptance, not through persuasion but through exhaustion, as society adjusted itself to a conclusion it could not reverse. When at last the engagement was acknowledged without qualification, it felt less like triumph than equilibrium, a restoration of order achieved by conviction rather than compliance. Eliza and the Duke stood together in quiet understanding, aware that affection had not been declared in haste, but earned through patience, courage, and mutual regard. They knew the future would demand further resolve, yet they faced it without illusion, committed not to perfection, but to honesty sustained beyond ceremony. As the season yielded to summer, London resumed its rhythm, carrying new scandals and ambitions elsewhere, leaving behind a story already settling into memory. For Eliza, the carriage that once marked humiliation now symbolized passage, not escape, and she entered her days with the knowledge that she had been seen, judged, and chosen without surrender of self. For the Duke, the choice affirmed that authority carried meaning only when exercised with conscience, and that love, when claimed honorably, strengthened rather than diminished duty. Together, they accepted a future neither effortless nor indulgent, but deliberately shaped, trusting that what had endured scrutiny would endure time as well. And so, what began in rain and misunderstanding concluded in clarity, leaving behind the certainty that a single moment, met with courage, could reorder a life without apology. The carriage rolled forward into lamplit streets, steady and unhurried, bearing with it not a fairy tale, but a resolve tested by consequence, and promising that devotion, once chosen freely, could withstand the watchful world beyond the door, enduring not because it was hidden, but because it had been spoken, witnessed, and claimed without retreat, fear, or regret, under the open sky, in full view of history, consequence, and time itself onward.